What does the return of Donald J. Trump to the presidency in the United States mean for energy and climate change? In particular, what will his administration's policies mean for international markets and cooperation in these areas? We're going to explore answers to these important questions in today's episode. Welcome to Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. This is a channel dedicated to providing information about energy and environmental markets and policies from around the world. These videos are designed for anyone who is interested. They are suitable for business people and policymakers. They can be a resource for students doing research for assignments. They will also help everyday citizens who hear about these topics, perhaps in the media, but want to know more information. I am Dr. Daniel Rossetto, the host of the channel. I've worked in the energy and environmental markets for over 2 decades. Before we get started, if you like these videos, be sure to click like and subscribe. Share with your colleagues, family and friends. This is a fantastic way to support the channel. It will really help me to make the videos that you want to see. The return of Donald J. Trump to the presidency of the United States of America for a second term in office has the world talking. The United States has the world's largest economy in nominal terms, so it is a country of great significance. It seems like almost every day there is something happening, with announcements, policies, and even controversies. The news flow comes through so thick and fast that we are often left with little time to analyse what is happening. Underneath the noise, though, are there any patterns emerging? Are there any signs that help us to understand what is going on? We are going to examine what has happened so far on energy and climate change. Since coming to office on the 20th of January 2025, President Trump has been very busy. He has issued a large number of executive orders, some of which are directly focused on topics of energy and climate change. We also gained a lot of information from his address to the joint sitting of the Congress on the 4th of March. During the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to analyse what has been declared and what the likely significance will be. Let us begin with the issue of energy. Of central interest here are the executive orders called Declaring a National Energy Emergency and Unleashing American Energy, both of which were issued on the 20th of January. Specifically, the objectives of the orders are as follows. Quote, energy and critical minerals identification, leasing, development, production, transportation, refining and generation capacity of the United States are all far too inadequate to meet the nation's energy needs. The nation needs reliable, diversified and affordable supply of energy to drive manufacturing, transportation, agriculture and defence industries, and to sustain the basics of modern life and military preparedness. The nation's inadequate energy supply and infrastructure causes and makes worse high energy prices that devastate Americans, particularly those living on low and fixed incomes." End quote. This executive order also calls for repealing of a number of other climate-related executive orders from the previous administration. I'll put a link in the description so you can see a full list of the repealed orders. Under these orders, the term energy or energy resources is taken to mean, quote, crude oil, natural gas, refined petroleum products, uranium, coal, biofuels, geothermal heat, kinetic movement of flowing water, and critical minerals. Interestingly, neither wind nor solar are included in this definition. Other renewable energy forms are, like hydro, biofuels, and geothermal. If you are wondering why critical minerals are included in the definition of energy, let us first consider the International Energy Agency's definition. Quote, critical minerals such as copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt and rare earth elements are essential components of many of today's rapidly growing energy technologies, from wind turbines and electricity networks to electric vehicles. Demand for these materials is growing quickly as energy transitions gather pace. The types of mineral resources used vary by technology. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese and graphite are crucial to battery performance. Rare earth elements are essential for permanent magnets used in wind turbines and electric vehicle motors. Electricity networks need a huge amount of aluminium and copper, the latter of which is the cornerstone of all electricity-related technologies." End quote. Now this suggests that renewables like solar and wind are not necessarily excluded from the executive order. Their mention is just not as explicit. During his address to the joint session of Congress, President Trump linked the energy emergency to the fight against inflation. Quote, "To further combat inflation," President Trump said, "we will not only be reducing the cost of energy, but we will also be ending the waste of taxpayer dollars." End quote. In other words, President Trump believes that shortages of energy are contributing to higher than necessary consumer prices. The term taxpayer dollar is likely to include reference to the federal program that subsidizes clean energy industries known as the Inflation Reduction Act. The program's name is a little bit odd, as it was at its core designed to, quote, "invest in domestic energy production while promoting clean energy," end quote. The Inflation Reduction Act was put in place a few years ago and provides substantial public funding for clean energy production in the United States by way of subsidy. In some ways, the program had a similar aim to that of President Trump, to produce more energy. The previous administration, however, had been very focused on subsidizing new energy production and doing this with public funds. Many players in other countries had in fact complained that the Inflation Reduction Act was drawing capital into the United States at others' expense. In some ways, therefore, the Inflation Reduction Act was in fact an America First policy, perhaps in all but name. The Trump administration seems more intent on removing regulations that would otherwise impede new projects as opposed to providing subsidies. What has been the reaction to President Trump's approach from the energy industry? In a recent report published by the Financial Times, some energy executives are looking for more signs of stability. Executive orders are directives from the president, but they can be easily overturned when there is a change in administration. The stability to which the executives refer would likely come through enacting these policies through legislation. Legislation would require that a broader group of lawmakers agree with the proposed approach. This kind of action would make it more difficult for a future president to repeal those provisions and thereby provide greater investment certainty. The next executive order of interest is called Putting America First in International Environmental Agreements. This order was also released on the 20th of January. Its objective is, quote, "The United States must grow its economy and maintain jobs for its citizens while playing a leadership role in global efforts to protect the environment. Over decades, with the help of sensible policies that do not encumber private sector activity, the United States has simultaneously grown its economy, raised worker wages, increased energy production, reduced air and water pollution, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. The United States' successful track record of advancing both economic and environmental objectives should be a model for other countries. In recent years, the United States has purported to join international agreements and initiatives that do not reflect our country's values or contributions to the pursuit of economic and environmental objectives. Moreover, these agreements steer American taxpayer dollars to countries that do not require or merit financial assistance in the interests of the American people." End quote. This order contains an instruction for the United States to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change. The order also calls for an immediate halt to the United States Climate Finance Plan. Provision of climate finance, a form of development aid, from the public budget is part of the commitment that developed countries make under the Paris Agreement. In this recent Washington Post report, a Treasury spokesperson said that the United States, quote, would continue to engage with partner countries on energy and investment issues of common interest, end quote. In other words, the United States will not necessarily stop supporting developing countries. It will do so, however, based on its own bilateral dealings with countries and not necessarily through multilateral institutions. Beyond this, the United States has a reasonably patchy record with international climate agreements over the years. In 2001, for example, it decided not to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. It has never had a federal carbon pricing system, and it didn't engage formally with the international cooperation mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol. The climate plans of previous administration, the nationally determined contribution, explicitly excluded the use of the new Article 6 mechanism of the Paris Agreement in any case. Even the Inflation Reduction Act is a domestically focused program and does not drive international cooperation. The US is also, at least for now, not proposing to leave the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, while withdrawing from the Paris Agreement sounds quite dramatic, it probably isn't a fatal blow to international efforts. In and of itself, the decision probably doesn't change a lot. There is, however, evidence that the United States is moving towards a more bilateral approach to cooperation based on explicit national interest. During the President's address to Congress on the 4th of March, he also mentioned a few other items of relevance to energy and climate markets. The comments also linked issues to other themes like tackling inflation and rebuilding sovereign manufacturing capability. Some of the most important quotes are as follows. First of all, quote, "We suffered the worst inflation, perhaps even in the history of our country. As president, I'm fighting every day to reverse this damage and make America affordable again," end quote. Quote, "Upon taking office, I imposed an immediate freeze on all federal hiring, a freeze on all new federal regulations, and a freeze on all foreign aid," end quote. Quote, "The previous administration cut the number of new oil and gas leases by 95%, slowed pipeline construction to a halt, and closed more than 100 power plants. We are opening up many of those power plants right now," end quote. Quote, "I have also imposed a 25% tariff on foreign aluminium, copper, lumber, and steel. Because if we don't have, as an example, steel and lots of other things, we don't have a military, and frankly, we won't have a country very long, end quote. Quote, whatever they tax us, we will tax them, end quote, in reference to reciprocal tariffs that will apply from the 2nd of April 2025. And quote, in the near future, I want to do as has not been done in the last 24 years, and that is balance the federal budget. We are going to balance it, end quote. Quote, to unshackle our economy, I have directed that for every one new regulation, 10 old regulations must be eliminated, end quote. Quote, to boost our defence industrial base, we are going to resurrect the American shipbuilding industry, including commercial and military shipbuilding, end quote. Quote, and I also want to make interest payments on car loans tax deductible, but only if the car is made in America, end quote. Quote, as part of our tax cuts, we want to cut taxes on domestic production and all manufacturing. And just as we did before, we will provide 100% expensing, end quote. And then finally, quote, upon taking office, I withdrew from the unfair Paris Climate Accord, which was costing us trillions of dollars that other countries were simply not paying, end quote. Based on the executive orders we have seen so far and these comments made in the President's address to Congress, 4 priorities are becoming clear. The first priority is that there is a change in the approach being taken to bring down inflation. The energy emergency is very much linked to the first priority. It is one pillar of the strategy. Another key pillar is that of reducing government spending and balancing the federal budget. The United States has operated with budget deficits, that is, with spending that is greater than income, for more than 2 decades. The second priority is that the United States wants to make sure its relations with other countries serve more directly its national interests. Withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is connected to a financial fairness argument. President Trump has explicitly called that agreement unfair. If the United States is going to send funds to other countries, the President clearly wants the expenditure tied more closely to national interest. Is that a surprise? Probably not. The President talks about, quote, the pursuit of economic and environmental objectives, end quote. In this respect, he appears to believe that environmental protection and economic development can be delivered together. Thirdly, the President appears prepared to flex economic power to bring manufacturing back to the United States. The introduction of reciprocal tariffs is a clear signal of this. President Trump appears to be risking higher prices for US consumers to drive change in the policies in other countries. That is, policies connected to trade and bilateral relations with the United States. The freeze on foreign aid payments further highlights this. It appears as well that these positions are up for negotiation, but the negotiations will be bilateral, nation to nation. President Trump is seemingly deliberately moving away from relying on international forums and institutions. Fourth, there is a connection between manufacturing and the country's ability to maintain its status as a great power going forward. No more so is this priority evident than in the quote from the President's speech on the 4th of March. Quote, if we don't have, as an example, steel and lots of other things, we don't have a military, and quite frankly, We just don't have a country very long, end quote. Energy is also a crucial input into manufacturing, so the emergency is also connected to the fourth observed priority. Lots of people fervently agree with President Trump's approach, others stridently against it. While the priorities seem clear, only time will tell whether the approaches are going to be successful. In addition to the observed priorities, a few other patterns are emerging. First of all, President Trump seems more willing to explain his policies using realism or realpolitik than is normally the case. Realpolitik is a term used to describe state politics based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. In other words, realists believe that nations will take decisions that accord with interests and are not driven so much by ideology. Sometimes, where economic outcomes clash with national interest or security, realism says that states will choose the latter. Free trade among countries can be a casualty in this context. That also seems to be true of the Trump tariffs approach. As realist scholars like Professor John Mearsheimer have said, quote, American foreign policy has usually been guided by realist logic, although the public pronouncements of its leaders might lead one to think otherwise, end quote. This is because citizens are quite liberal and prefer arguments made in more morally based terms. Another clear example is that President Trump appears quite focused on the relative gains of other nations in their dealings with the United States. In other words, President Trump is particularly focused on whether other nations fare better than the United States in their bilateral and trade dealings. He appears focused on relative gains, and that is an argument that is strongly connected with realpolitik. Relative gains concerns have in fact been a feature of United States climate policy now for a long time. The United States Senate decision in 1997, known as the Byrd-Hagel Resolution, which passed with 98 votes to 0, is an example. It explicitly forbade the United States from joining any climate agreement that did not apply emissions caps on developing countries as well. The resolution asserted that such an agreement would result in, quote, serious harm to the economy of the United States, end quote. The significance of the Senate majority against this concept probably goes a long way to explaining why there's been no federal emissions trading system ever enacted in the United States. It also probably helps to explain why the United States were never in a position to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. It is natural that people would react to President Trump's return to office in the United States. The policies of any incoming administration are extremely important for determining policy for the next 4 years. However, there is also a bit more to it. Energy infrastructure needs big investment, and it is largely investment that comes from the private sector, not government. Business people making these investment decisions are interested not solely in the next 4 years. It is also important to consider what happens or could happen over the next 10 to 15 years. As seen earlier, energy executives are already calling for action through legislation rather than just executive order. This would provide a more solid foundation for the new policies. We know that this will be President Trump's last term in office, as he has already served 1 term. Of course, nobody has a crystal ball capable of determining who will be elected president at the next election in 2028. But the high degree of uncertainty about what will follow the Trump administration will no doubt have some impact. It may also be worthwhile to examine what has happened with US emissions over the last few decades. This first chart shows total greenhouse gas emissions since 2000, which spans a period in which there have been 5 presidents: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald J. Trump's first term, and then Joe Biden. A similar trend can be observed in the second chart, which shows emissions per capita. All of these presidents have had different approaches to energy and to climate change. Yet, after what appeared to be a peak in emissions during 2005, emissions in the United States have been trending downwards thereafter. Since the pandemic-related drop, the trend appears to have been restored. This includes the 4 years in which President Trump served his first term in office and withdrew from the Paris Agreement for the first time. It is also very important to recognize that states in the US have a degree of autonomy when it comes to energy and climate policy. For example, almost a quarter of the states in the US operate their own greenhouse gas emission trading systems. States have their own renewable energy support programs too. Not all of the states will be adopting similar approaches to the Trump administration. Despite this, the real issue is going to be the cost of producing energy in the United States. If abundant supplies of energy are intended to keep downward pressure on prices and to help ease inflation, those prices still need to be sufficient to justify production. In an energy market that is reliant on private sector investment, the opportunity to, in quotes, drill baby drill, still needs to be profitable. The incentive to drill for oil, for example, relies on the cost of production being lower than the market price of a barrel of oil. In the United States, at least in relation to oil and gas, a lot of the new reserves will be quite costly to produce. There is also the question about whether executive orders are sustainable or if legislation might be needed to provide long-term investment certainty. In summary, we can see there are several checks on the Trump administration when it comes to energy and climate. First and foremost is that we know President Trump will only be able to serve one term. This is because he has already served one term before. Nobody knows who is going to be president from 2029 or how similar that president's policies will be to President Trump. So the future is quite uncertain. Secondly, states in the US have a lot of influence over energy and climate markets and policies. As we know, many of them will be taking a different approach to the federal administrations. History shows us that presidential administrations have limited impact on the trajectory of United States emissions. Despite this, President Trump's policies and his new approach continues to attract a lot of attention. President Trump's energy and climate priorities appear to be clear. The first is that there is a change in the approach being taken to bring down inflation. The second is that the United States wants to make sure its relations with other countries more directly serve its national interests. Third, the President appears prepared to flex economic power to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And fourth, there is a clear connection between manufacturing and the country's ability to maintain its status as a great power into the longer term. Just how successful President Trump will be in achieving the administration's energy and climate priorities remains to be seen. After today's video, I hope you'll feel like you are now in a better position to understand the priorities and what the implications will be. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.